For this video, I'll be walking you through how to style and validate a login and registration form with CSS only. I'll also show you how to handle the data request on the server as well. I'll share with you some common techniques, tools, and best practice, as well as everything you need to understand when it comes to login and registration form handling. In the end, we should have a register form like this, which we complete by parts and submit, and then it redirects us to the login page where we can go and log in as well. Support the channel by liking or commenting on this video. Subscribe so you don't miss out on anything. Now, let's dive in. I have here an empty forms project open on one of my favorite IDEs, WebStorm. Nothing to see here. So the first thing I need to start is my npm project by running the npm init command with the Y flag for yes to all questions it asks. This creates a package.json file with all this info you see here on the console. The next command I need to run is to install Express and HTML+. HTML+ is actually a before semicolon tool, which is a template engine, language, and site builder. It uses normal HTML with some special attributes and tags, much like Angular. The cool thing is that it handles any CSS preprocessor and TypeScript file you link in your HTML file. It also ensures that any modern CSS you write will work on any browser. Has robust data contextualization and handling right from the template, and provides ability to create your own server-side tags and attributes to simplify your work and more. I'll be showing you a lot of that in this video, and how starting a project with this is super simple. Requires less configuration and setup, and will also build your project for production without any additional installation. It is a batteries included type of module. I'll copy this quick starting code snippet here for this project. I'll create our server.js file and paste the copied code there. All this is doing is importing engine from HTML+, create an Express app to start the engine with. It also specified the path to the directory where all pages will be contained, but for me it will be called src for source, which I'll then create here. Then it creates an HTTP server and start listening on port 3000. To run our server here, I'll add a script to the package.json file of executing node for server.js file. I'll also create an index.html file as the home page with welcome as title. HTML+ creates all site routing based on your HTML file structure inside the source directory. If I run my start script now and go to the browser on localhost 3000, we see the welcome title. Our website is ready for all coming changes now with everything we need. Since we are doing the registration form handling, let's create the register page and route first. For now, all I'll add is the register title. When I go to /register on my browser, we see the register page with the title we set. Next, let's set up the endpoint to which we will be sending the form data to be processed. It is a simple Express post endpoint for register, where for now, all I'll do is re-render our register page and also log the body of the request, which will contain the registration form data we sent. Since I'll be doing a lot of changes on the server, it is a little tedious to manually kill and start the server all the time, so I'll install a module called nodemon, which can do that work for me. In the package.json start script, I'll use nodemon instead of node and tell it to wash the project directory for changes, specifying I need changes on any file extension with the E flag with start symbol value, and that whenever changes happen, it should execute the server.js file with node. Now, when I run the npm start command, we start the server on watch mode. With our simple register endpoint set up, we can go to the register page file and create our registration form, which the action is the register endpoint we just created, and the method is post, as the endpoint is the post endpoint. For how we need the form to send the data, we specify the type attribute with multipart form data as value. There are other ways to send the data, but this is a pretty common one to use. I'll also add a register button. All buttons are typed submit by default, by the way. I'll also add a text field of name test, just so we are able to type something to test if the server receives it or not. Now, when I go to the page and type some random character and click submit, we can see our log we set up in the register post endpoint, which confirms that the form is posting data to the right endpoint, but the body is undefined. But I was expecting the text I type in the field. The reason for this is that even though the form is sending the data, the server does not recognize the data encryption of multipart form data, so therefore does not collect the data for us. For that, I'll install another popular module called Multer, which I'll then import in our server and proceed to create our upload object. Multer takes options, but for this type of data, we don't need to specify anything, as default is fine. I'll leave the link for you to learn more about this module in the description. This upload object has many different methods that, when called, return an express middleware. So in between the register endpoint and the handler callback function, I'll call the none method, which will collect that multipart data for us before the request gets to the handler, where it will be logged for now. Now back to the registration form, I'll type some random text again and click submit. And now the object containing our data is logged as expected. With that, we are now able to send data from browser to the server easily. Now we need to define the data content that we are expecting to be sent to the server. And for that, I'll create an info object with all fields we are expecting, but empty. Then I'll spread the request body inside, so if the body contains any of the fields, we'll override these fields. Otherwise, it will be empty for us to catch. I'll create two empty fields for error messaging and the field they happen, and loop over this info object keys, where I'll check if the field is empty, and if so, I'll update the field by removing any dash name if any, and then render the register page again. Only this time we will send the error message and the field where the error happened as response. In our template, we can actually read this data that is passed to our page, and I'll simply render the error message in the error message paragraph using HTML plus data binding single curly braces. Seems like I have an info error. That's because I use for off instead of for in, and like that, we see the paragraph with the error. If I refresh the page, we get an error that the error mesh is not defined. If you take a closer look, this error is very useful since it specifies the name of the file and the exact place in the template that it happened. This error is because the error message is only rendered with the template when there is an error. But one thing I can do is use the if attribute to check if there is an error before trying to render the paragraph. Notice it also logs the error in the console as well. If we re-render, we get a similar error, but it's now in the if attribute. HTML Plus offers a way around this by allowing the usage of the this keyword, which always refers to the data context you are currently in. When I add the this keyword, the template renders fine because we check in the error message in the current context first. If we inspect, we can see that it did not render the paragraph tag with the error. Now, if I type something and submit the form again, we see the error, but I'll replace the dash with an empty space so it is more human readable. With that, we have completed full data lifecycle, which is the ability to send the data to the server from the template and also respond back with the data to the template. Only now we can do everything we need to do for this form. Let's add our form content, but before that, I want to change this page into something it is easy to reuse. For that, I'll create a partial directory and create a layout partial, which for HTML Plus must be an HTML file that starts with underscore and can be placed anywhere inside the page directory, in this case, the source directory. Now I'll copy the entire register page and paste inside the layout partial. I'll be expecting a title for the site, and I'll add an inject placeholder with ID of style, which is pretty much adding a placeholder in the template where tags with such inject ID will be placed in. For the body, I'll add another inject tag without any ID. That means that everything else should be placed here. I'll also add a placeholder for all script tags and change this to put the content inside the main tag instead. With our partial complete, we can go to the register page and include it using the include tag, which we can use the partial attribute to provide the name of the partial file we want without the path or the leading underscore. Since the partial expects a title, I'll provide one for this page, but in general, partials inherit any data that this page has access to or creates. A partial is just a part of the page that exists in a different file Inside the include tag, we can put the content to inject into the place orders of the partial. Our title and form can go inside, and if we go in the browser and refresh, nothing seems to have changed, but we have a layout partial that we can reuse for any page we create. Now, inspecting it shows our register page content was placed inside the main tag correctly as we expected. Now I'll create a SAS file for layout that we can reuse as well. Here I'll add general style related to the layout, like making HTML and body tag 100% width and height, define 16 pixels as the website base font size, use any sans serif font, and remove padding and margin. If you watch any video of mine, you should know I always box size border box everything. For this, I'll also remove top margin of all heading and paragraph tag, but this is just a preference of mine, nothing you have to do. Now I'll create a register SAS file, and back on the page, I'll link it. And one thing that HTML Plus template allows me to do is link any preprocessor file directly. For this link tag, I'll add the inject ID attribute, so it places this link tag in the right place inside layout partial, which is at the end of the head tag. Inside the register SAS file, I'll import layout CSS partial file, and back on the browser, if we refresh, we should see the sudden style change, and by inspecting it, we can confirm that inject the style tag in the right place. Now back on the form, I'll make use of the field set, which makes grouping form sections super easy and it is fun to style. I'll add a legend for the field set and proceed to create our fields. I have another video where I shared my technique of styling any input fields with some super cool examples that you can check. Here we have the first name and last name fields inside the label tag with a span for label. I'll repeat this field set 2 more times and change the field details accordingly. The second section is to collect email and username, and the last one is to collect password and password confirmation. Now back in the browser, we can see the form bare bone. Pretty simple and ready to go. These fields are a bit of code, and another feature of HTML Plus is allowing us to create our own server-side tags and attributes that do and render anything we want. I'll create tags directory and the field tag file I want, where I'll define my field class. How you name your class or function is how the tag will be called, by the way. Here I'll add the render method, which simply returns the form field code that we had. The class is instantiated with a server-side node, which I can use to collect the attributes, but I'll set some defaults first for name, type, label, and value in case these are not provided. I'll also spread the code attribute inside as well. Now inside our render, I'll deconstruct it and grab label. Everything else will be called attributes. With that, I can replace code accordingly. One method that HTML Plus exposed is the compose tag string function, which I can use to compose this input tag to include the rest of the attribute instead of manually setting them. It takes node like the one in the constructor, or a node-like object where the tag name for this is the input, and I'll set attribute deconstructor as well. Like that, we create a reusable field tag to reuse. I'll export it, and from the server file, I'll import it. And one of the options that HTML Plus engine takes is a list of custom tags to use. Now in my template, instead of the input wrapped in label, I'll define my field and pass the attributes. If I refresh my register page, everything looks the same, and we can see the labels rendered as before with all the right attributes as specified. I'll do the same for the rest of the form as well. You could also use partials for this, but custom tags are much easier to read and much more performant. With that, my form is much cleaner and easy to use as well. And I can reuse the field on the login later on, as you will see. One thing I can do is add a CSS file to the style field and import it inside the register CSS file as well, but I'll get back to that style after I style the page first. For the main tag, I'll make sure it takes full viewport width and height at a 25 pixels internal space with auto overflow and some greenish background. For the form, I'll set the width to be 100% minus 40 pixels, so it leaves a 20 pixels margin on both sides, but I'll actually limit this width to be up to 350 pixels. And for this to work, I'll add a margin of 100 view height top and auto for left and right so it can be centered. If you look at the browser, we see it capping at 350 pixels width. Something seems wrong since the website scale is not correct. Seems like I forgot to specify the viewport scale for the website. Another benefit for this layout template is that you only have to add the change in one place and all pages get affected by it. Now, if I try to resize the page, we can see when there is less than 350 pixels available space, it leaves 20 pixels on either side since its size capped at 100% minus 40 pixels. For the field setback, I'll set white background, 3 pixels rounded corner, and remove the appearance. Another thing HTML Plus does for me is auto prefix and change any modern CSS into something that will work in any browser. Like you can see here, it added prefixes for appearances. I'll continue by removing the border, hide overflow, and remove all margin and leave it only 25 on the bottom. With width of 100% and some internal padding, where the padding of the left and the right will define how far the legend tag is placed from the side of the field set, and in this case I want them 20 pixels from left. Now for the legend, I'll give it dark background, some padding, light text, rounded corners, 80% of the base website font size, and 3% for the letter spacing. Now we can go ahead and add style for the fields, starting by display flex it with column direction, so anything inside stacks on top of each other, taking full width, and some 50 pixels margin, bottom, and relative positioning. For the span tag containing the label, I'll set 80% of the base font size, some margin to distance it from the input field below, dark gray color, and some left and right padding to push the text in. For the input field, I'll set it to be 40 pixels tall, no border or appearance, almost white background, 3 pixels around the corners with some left and right padding. Looking good and simple. Again, for more complex fields, styles, and animation, check my input video on the link in the description. I don't like this outline color on focus, so I'll change it to a purplish one. Now for the form submit button, I'll set 40 pixels tall, no border and appearance with almost black background, white text, 3 pixels around the corner, uppercase letter with 5% letter spacing, 25 pixels side padding, and pointer cursor. Our form now looks much to par and could probably benefit from a nice bottom spacing. One super cool thing that we can do is use HTML and CSS only to validate the form and prevent form submission if invalid, which I'll start by making all fields required. And on the CSS, I'll check if the form is invalid and remove the ability to click on the submit button with the pointer event of none, add a not allow cursor point, and fade it a little. If we check our form, the button is faded and clicking on it does nothing for now. But if I add some minimal text in the fields and minimal valid email, the button comes to life. We can also remove browser validation with no validate form attribute to remove any browser pop-ups on the fields. I also like to communicate with the user when a field is valid or not. So for that, I'll add a span tag inside our field with class of valid indicator. Repeat for all fields as well. If you go to the browser, nothing shows, even if we check what is inside the input. And that's because we need to handle it inside our custom field tag class. I'll create an extra content property where I'll call the render children method of the node, which will grab anything placed inside our tag and compile it and return a string. Then inside the render, we set the extra content after the input. Back on the browser, when I inspect the code and expand the label tag, we can see the valid indicator span after the input field. Now let's style it by targeting the field where I'll absolute the valid indicator. Inline blocking, 20 pixels width and height with 50% border radius so it becomes a circle. Position it on the right and top 0, but translate it on the x-axis 50% so it It is half in and half out of the field, and give it gray background so we can see it. Checking the browser, we can see the valid indicator, but since we need to push it down a little, so I'll set top of 30 pixels to shift it. Now it is where I want it, but this field needs some side margins. Like that, now the indicator looks ready to go, and all it needs is an icon. I have Googled and grabbed a couple of links to some nice icons for check and X icon, which I'll store in the SAS variable. Now in the background of the valid indicator, I'll specify the URL, but I get an error, probably because I did not do string interpolation correctly. Let's fix that, and still nothing. Okay, that's not how you are supposed to declare variable. Equal sign is not valid for SAS. It is valid for stylus, but not valid for SAS. Now I can center the background with 10 pixel size and no repeat, and the icon shows up nicely. Now when the input is valid, I can use the adjacent CSS combinator to grab the valid indicator that follows and change the background with a green color. Oops, wrong icon. Now when I add minimal text to make the field valid, we see the indicators go from gray to green. Super cool, and no JavaScript needed. Right now the validation is not very robust. The only rule is that the fields must not be empty. What we can do is define patterns that these fields values must match to consider valid. For that, I'll create a variable which is a special tag in HTML plus template, where I can define a name pattern for first and last name using regex as value. For this, it must start with a lower and uppercase letter followed by at least another lower and uppercase letter. Now I can use this variable name and set the pattern value inside the curly braces for data binding. Same goes for the last name. I can copy this variable and create an email and username pattern one. By the way, the variable values are scoped, so they can only be referred after and inside the tag it was declared at, which is another feature of HTML+. For the email pattern, I have a regex for it already, same for the username as well, and I can use them to set a pattern attribute on the field. The email pattern allows us at least one letter number and these symbols before the @ symbol, followed by any number or lowercase letter dash and or dot, and then a dot followed by at least 2 letters. There are better and more robust email regex, but this will do for us for now. The username must contain at least 6 to 35 letters, lower or uppercase, and underscore. Username varies side to side, so make sure you find a regex for the one you need. Finally, the password pattern, which consists of some look ahead patterns that says look ahead and check if there is at least a number, a lowercase letter, a uppercase letter, and any of these symbols, and the whole string must be at least 8 to 35 characters long. To better organize this, I'll move all variables to the top to make them global for anything after. Now we can check the form and test this. Seems like the name pattern is not good. Okay, I can remove the minimum 2 characters here and require 1 instead. I also misspelled the pattern attribute wrong. Now for name, I need to type 2 letters for it to be marked as valid. Numbers don't work. Email now have a pattern to match. Cool. Username takes letters, numbers, and underscores. Typing number loses the green indicator, as you can see here. For password, I'll just type password with uppercase P, @ symbol instead of A, and 0 instead of O to make it pass. We will leave the backend to determine if the passwords match or not. Like that, the form validation on the browser is complete, and we'll handle server validation in a bit. First, one thing I want to do is only show one field set at a time with next and previous button for navigation. For that, I'll add a register TypeScript file and link it in the registration page, providing the script inject ID so it can be injected at the bottom of the page. Another great feature of HTML+ engine is that it allows us to work with TypeScript for our website. If we inspect the page, we can see that the script tag was added to the bottom of the page. This is totally optional, but I could also specify tsconfig file just to have more control over my code. For that, I'll initialize TypeScript with tsc init, which will create a basic tsconfig file for me, which I'll just change to compile to ES6 instead, which is a nicer and easier to understand code. Now I can create a block to put my code in. First thing I need to grab my form by ID, and if there is a form, I'll collect all the field sets, then create some tracker variable for the current set visible, which by default will be the first at index 0. Next, we need a reference of the field set element, which I'll use the index to grab it from the list. Now for each field set, I'll check if the index is same as the active one to hide or show accordingly. If we check the browser, we should see only the first field set visible. Now inside the form, I'll add a footer with the navigation buttons, and they should show under the field set on the page now. For the script file, I'll get reference to all of them by requiring them by their class. And if they are all there, I'll attach a click event to the next button first, where I'll just increment the set index by 1, but I'll use a mod technique to make sure the index resets back to 0 once it is the same as the field list length. I'll log it so you know what I mean. Back in the browser with the clean console, you can see that when I click, it increments to 1, then 2, and resets back to 0. But I realize now that this might be redundant since I'm planning on hiding the button when that happens. But now you know the trick. I'll do the same for the previous button, but decrement the index instead. And I'll create a navigation function which takes the index and can call after updating the index. I first check if the index is the last one and show the submit button, but it is screaming at me. I need to specify that these are HTML element and not element to fix it. And now it complains of something else. It's telling me that this can be null, so I'll unit null to the type. That's actually the reason I checked these buttons in this if statement, and should be good now. I'll show the previous button and hide the next button, else I'll hide the submit button and show previous and next buttons. But for the previous button, I'll only show it if the index is not 0. Now I'll just update the current field set element by first hiding the current one, then use the index to show the field set at the position, and only then update the field set element tracker with a new one, again using the index. Since I forgot to hide the buttons on initial, so I'll call the navigation function with the current field set index. Still not working. Oh, okay, I'm supposed to show the new field set. Now it works fine, but I want these buttons to appear on right and left side, so I'll make the next and submit button float right and previous float left. I could also use the display flex, but old habits die hard, I guess. Because I use float, I'll need to clear it with the after pseudo element. Oops, this is supposed to be footer and not form. Now all is looking great, but this register button needs to stand out a little. So I'll change its background. I'll grab the suggested purple here. Maybe a green color would be better. For the final enhancement, I'll set slide keyframe for the field set, which simply slides it up as it is fading into view. So at 0%, it'll shift it down 50 pixels with 30% opacity. And at 100%, I'll transform to 0 and 100% opacity. From TypeScript, I'll set the animation of slide that takes half a second with ease, easing, and stay forwards on the end state. If we try this, we can see that it is something very simple. And what we can do is make the buttons appear on top, so it appears like it's sliding up from behind the buttons. For that, I'll relative position the footer so the z-index makes effect, and set that to 1, which is above the default z-index of 0. Now let's wrap this registration form by adding server-side validation and handle solve saving the user. I'll actually create a server directory to put the server file to better organize things. I'll create register servers to handle all the registration logic. I'll first add the validation info method that will validate the request body. We will not be dealing with any database, so I'll create a users array here to mock a database. I'll now copy these defaults into register class. Next, I'll copy what we have in the register post endpoint handler and change things accordingly. I'll have to return the errors instead of render. This is also complaining I haven't checked if the key is part of the object, which is something you need to do when using a for in loop. I'll also add a save user method, which will simply add the user info into the users array and also create an ID for the user as well. I am using a basic unique alphanumeric ID generator. In a real project, the database will do this part for you, and this save user method is where you would call your database to save the data in the table or document you want. This is all where you hash and salt the password before you save the user. Now I'll export the service, but I'll turn it into a singleton, which means anytime I import this, I will always get the same instance. From a server, we can import our service, and from the register handler, I'll call the validate function with the request body and collect the result. If there is an error message in the result, I'll then render the register page, again passing the result and the body as well, so we can later use it in the forms so the user can change where needed with the rest of the form field. If everything is okay, I'll then take the user to the login page with the redirects so they can go ahead and log in. Now I'll simply create our login page using layout partial with the login title for now, passing the correct page title as well. Seems like I cannot run server. This is because I forgot to update the path to the source director for the engine since I changed it. Now, to validate the rest of the fields, I'll use the same regex from the template to check each field. I'll copy the name regex first and use the regex test method to check the first name. And do the same thing for the last name as well. Now, if it is not valid, I'll simply add a custom error message, set the error field. Finally, I'll return an object with the error message and field. I'll do the same thing for the email, username, and password. The message must state exactly why the data is not valid based on the regex. Another check you have to do is to check if the passwords actually match and set the error info accordingly as well. If all the fields are good to go, we need to make sure the same user is not registered again. For that, we need to query the database using email and password. For this example, I'll simply use the find method on the array to find the user with the same email or username. Now, if there was a match, it could mean two things. There is a user with the provided email or the username is already taken. So we first check if the existing username is same as this one, but the email is different. In this case, the username is already taken, else the user already exists and should log in instead. We could also move this check user for when we are saving the user instead for better handling. I'll leave that for you as homework, or you can check the source code in the link below. Now in the handler, if no error, we will try to save the user before redirecting to the login page. Now back to the page, we have a problem. I hard-coded the first field set to always show first, but if the error happened in a different field set, we will be showing the wrong field set. So to fix that, I'll create a variable name set1field where I'll check if the error field is either the first or last name. If so, I use another special HTML plus attribute to use a class based on a condition. I'll set class has error if set1field is true. I'll repeat this logic for the other field sets as well, just changing the field names they contain, then add the class and conditionally. Now, to be able to submit invalid forms, I'll comment out the invalid check in CSS. Seems like I have an error in the registered service. Seems like I forgot to use the default info. Now, when I submit the empty form, we see the error which remains unstyled. Let me quickly style it. It will have a red background, 90% font size, 10 pixels padding, 3 pixels around the corners, some bottom margin, and white text. Now it should look like an error. If I type the first name and resubmit, it complains about last name. Remember that we are sending the form data back to the template here, so we could use that to autocomplete the form to save typing. I'll set the value of the field using the return data and repeat that for every field. Seems like I messed up somewhere with the square bracket. Got it. No dot is needed before the bracket. Now, if I submit bad data, the data is returned with the error and the form uses it. If the email is missing, we get an email error, but we are shown the wrong field set. If we inspect, we can see that the second field set has the class has error. We can use that piece of information to, instead of hard coding 0 for the field set index, we can actually look at the field set with that class using the findIndexArray method, which requires me to change this list into an array first with the from method. The findIndex will return the index if founded, otherwise return -1. What we can do is use the mathMax method to fall back to 0 if this does not find it. If it finds that the index will be 0 or greater, but if it is -1, mathMax will return 0 because 0 is greater than -1. Now, if we refresh, we can see that email error and the correct field set showing. If I complete the form correctly and submit, we can see that it redirects me to the login page as expected. One final nice thing we can help the user with is indicating which field is bad by using the valid indicator span tag that we have in the side field. So I'll use the conditional attribute to set a class on the valid indicator of error field. If the error field matches the field name, then repeat for all the fields. If we submit a bad form and inspect, we can see that the first name valid indicator has the error field class. On the CSS, we can target that class and use the error icon with a red background to show the bad field. Now, if we refresh the page, we see the red indicator with the X, and if we type the right thing, it becomes green. This is due to CSS specificity rules allowing this input style to override the error style. With that, our sign up form is officially done. We can now handle the login side of things. I'll first go ahead and use the layout partial for the home page as well. I'll change the title of the site and set a welcome title for the page. Very minimal. I'll copy the register form open tag to start with, changing the ID and the endpoint where I'll post the data to in the browser. Next, I'll copy the field tag, but I don't need the valid indicator inside, which makes this tag super flexible to work with in general. We don't need a lot of these attributes. For this form, we need a login and password field, and they are both required. I'll also add the login button. If we check the page, it looks very simple and enough for now. I'll come back for this for the styling in a little. Back on the server, I'll set up the login endpoint first, also using the motor upload non-middleware, and I'll also log the data. Now, if we fill the form and submit, oops, looks like I have 2 email fields here. Now, if I fill and submit, we can see the data logged in this console. So we will expecting an email and password field in the data object. And for now, I'll just re-render the login page, passing the email and password and an error message saying invalid password and email. For login forms, it's better not to specify which field is bad and to fill fast, or even add random delays to the response so hackers can't draw a conclusion on how you are handling things. I'll use the register error message paragraph to display the error as well. We can verify by checking the browser again. Now, to control access, we need to restrict access to the website. Now, if I go to the home page directly, I just have access, but that should not happen. We need to check if the user is logged or not first. To handle that, I'll set up a middleware before all endpoints, and this is because the way Express handles requests is by piping it from handler to handler based on the order you create them. So when the request comes, it first checks if it matches the register endpoint. If not, it checks if the login endpoint. And if not, it reaches our HTML plus engine, which then handles the routing to try to match the request to the page we have or redirect to 404 page. So if we set up a middleware before all others, we can check if the request is authorized to block and let it go through to the next handler, aka middleware. To handle authentication, I'll install Express Session, which will allow me to use section and cookies to check if the request is authorized or not. I'll import it, and before everything, I'll set it up as middleware. So similar to Multer handling data in the request, the Express Session will look for cookies in the request, parse them, and update the request with the data that we can check to verify if there is a valid token or session data to make a decision whether to let the request through or not. It takes a couple of options, and one of them is how we want to name the cookie. I'll set it to session ID, but you can set it to something less obvious like Bulldog, Nintendo, or whatever you want. It also takes a secret, and this is like a hash that it uses to generate the session IDs. It is like a password for cookies. If you don't have it, you can't translate the session ID into the data it represents. Normally, this secret is not stored in your server or file. It is best to grab it from the environment variable, which you can access through process env object, and we could name it session secret, for example. It is best to use environment variables and data that you specify when you run your server. For this, I'll just set mine to secret. I'll set it to not save uninitialized sessions and not to resave as well. You can read about these and other options by clicking the link below in the description. Now this will read the cookies and the request moves on to the next handler, which I'll first check if the request is not for the register page because we want anyone to access the register page. Next, I'll check if the request is for the login page. Then, if it is, I'll then check if the session data, which is in the case is the user info, which we haven't set anywhere yet. If there is a session user, then this user is logged in and has nothing to do in the login page. So we just redirect the user to the home page instead. If the request is not for the login page, then it means the request is for some protected page. So we check again for the user in the session. If there isn't any, we redirect the user to the login page so they can log in first. If any request falls through this check, we simply call the next request handler to do its job. If we go to the browser, we can check the application tab on Chrome here and go to cookies and see that there is nothing here. If I try to access the home page now, I get redirected to the login page. Our website now is authorized users only. Back on the server and the register service, I need a way to return a list of users from the database. This is where you would query the database to get users. I'll actually change it to query one user only by taking an email, and since we don't have a database, I'll loop the users array and try to find the user with that email. I like to set up my server before I add the database so I can get to focus on the workflow first, and then I can just replace things with database so I don't build my server around the database, which developers tend to do, which makes it hard to switch to a different database later on if you want to. In the login handler, I'll skip the data validation for now and I'll find the user, and if there is a user and password matches, Here I am just comparing password to each other, but using a database, you would probably save a hash password. So here you would have to unhash it and then compare the values. If that's fine, I'll add the user to the session and redirect the user to the home page. We can test this by going to register page and create our user, submit the form, and that creates the user and redirects us to login page. Here I use the same email and password to log in. When I submit, always good, so it just redirects me to the home page. If we inspect the cookies again, we can see that the session sent a cookie to the page and we see the weird value that it has here. Now what I can do in the home page is use user data to say welcome and the name of the user. To skip having to register all the time, I'll hard-coded a user object in the users array to test things. Now, if I use the same email and password to log in, it redirects me to the home page, but we get an error. This is because we are not sending the user info to the page yet. So another option that HTML Plus Engine takes is the on-page request, which must be a function. And this function is called with the request. And this request will contain our session because we set it up earlier by reading from the cookies using Express Session middleware. We should return an object with data, and this data will be passed to every page. For this, we want to send the user by reading it from the session. Remember that if requested reaches the engine, it is because it is authorized. Therefore, it will contain the user info. We see a session here, but this is an old one before we restarted the server, so it won't count. When we log in now, we get this home page and it says welcome John Doe by reading the user data. If we try to go back to the login page, we are redirected back to the home page again, but we can visit the register page just fine. With everything said, all we need now is to style the form and add validation, then come back to the server to add validation as well. Let's style the form first. I'll just copy the imports and style for main from register SCSS, then create a login SCSS file to pass it in. I'll have it to link the file to work, but I'll change the background to a purplish tone first. I'll also copy some style from the register form, but I'll change it to be a max 300 pixels instead. Now white backgrounds, round the corners by 3 pixels, dark text color, and some box shadow and relative positioning. I'll also add some padding to get content away from the sides. I'll style the error message next, and for that, I'll trigger one first. I want the error to appear on top of the form, so I'll absolute position it to top left corner. Red background, white text, some padding, make it 100% of the form width. Round the corner by 3 pixels with 80% base font size. When we check it, it becomes obvious it needs to be shifted up, so I'll transform it and translate it on the y-axis 100% and an additional 10 pixels, so it leaves a 10 pixels gap between the top of the form and the error. I'll also need more space, so I'll change the form top margin to 20 view height instead. This allows the form to position vertical always 20% of the viewport of top margin. Normally, what you would see in login forms are links to the reset passwords. Although I will be not handling them, I'll add them here and let you go figure it out as homework. I already showed you everything you will need to do it, so they will simply take you to another page with a form, and you will need to set up an endpoint to handle that data, very similar to the way I showed you here. I'll simply display flex the div containing the links and justify content with space between so both links stays on each other's side. Some margin top and bottom, but I'll use a negative value for the top to bring the links closer to the password field. And for any state, I'll use italic font style at 80%, gray color, and 2% letter spacing. Some side padding would look nice as well. For the login button, it is pretty much almost the same as the register button style. I'll use this suggested purple here. To prevent login when form is empty, I'll target the invalid state of the form and make the button 50% opaque, unclickable with pointer event of none, and not allowed cursor. I'll borrow the email pattern variable from register and use it here as well. And for the password, I'll keep this simpler by only requiring the password to be 8 characters long and not more than 35. Robust password validation makes more sense on the registration form than the login form. Now that the browser handles the validation, I can go to the server, and inside this login handler, before I query the user, I'll first make sure that the email and password match the regex. Now for the final touch, we are already sending the email and password back to the login page. So in the template, I'll use the return email to set the email field value. Now when my form returns an error, I'll just have to retype the password. Grab the code for this project in the description below. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like this video to support the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on anything. Once again, thanks for watching. Catch you on the next one. Bye bye.